brief discussion before I arrived with Jeff Steinberg. He and I were talking about the importance of what you just saw. And we were discussing it from the standpoint of what is called the Manhattan Project by LaRouche recently, but which would be nearly impossible to really understand unless we were clear about what actually it is that our organization does, why it does it, and in one sense, how we were born. We were born fighting by exposure exactly the sort of people and operations that did what was done in Paris. Now, this history is usually never referenced because over the course of decades, it became somewhat fashionable to avoid talking about it for reasons other than those given. The reasons given often alluded to supposed political mistakes that may have been made by our organization, and so actually that's not why we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it because we had abandoned for some period of time and have recently resurrected our actual organizing method. Now, it's probably best to just use exhibits. This magazine, which was published in 1974, tells a story about exactly what you are right now reading about in Paris. This magazine tells a story about what you could have read about if you looked at things like the Fort Hood shootings of 2009, in which the 13 people were killed by the Army psychologist, who was ostensibly a Muslim. This magazine describes the process of behavioral modification of the American population presently ongoing by means of what is referred to as Facebook, which is presently something that 53% of the American adult population uses. This magazine describes the method of exposure and neutralization of said operations, but is more important because it was a documentation at the time of what Lyndon LaRouche refers to as the Manhattan Project. Now, the significance of LaRouche as an individual, as a thinker, as a presence in the period of particularly 1966 through 1974 was that LaRouche uniquely provided a solution to the very pressing question of that time and of now, which is, if you had power, if you were not the complaining underling that the American citizen has pretended to be, if you admitted that the American citizen, combined with an executive office of the presidency that responded to that American citizen, was capable of resolving any and all important political problems in the lives of said citizens, if you actually engage in that admission, what would you do? Because fundamentally and finally, the truth is, the reason that most people, through most of their lives, remain the slaves of someone else or the subjects of other forces is because they don't know how to answer that question. It's pretty cold outside today. I was reminded, because of the cold, of a song that was recorded exactly in this period, 1974, which is when this magazine is from. It's called Winter in America. And it says various things, but a couple of the things it says primarily, it's winter in America, and all of the healers have been killed or have gone away. It's winter in America, and nobody is fighting because no one knows what to say. Nobody is fighting because no one knows what to say. And that is the problem. If you had the power, if all of your complaints were answered for the moment and you were actually sitting in either the Oval Office or its equivalent, what would you do? Now, I start with this because LaRouche answered this. What was great about being around at that time, Lyndon LaRouche, was that he came already with the answer to this question. But he posed it to us to say, well, you people say you want to change society. You people say you want to make a revolution. You people say you want to improve things because things are really terrible. What exactly do you want to do? And many of us, most of us, had to admit that we had no idea of what we wanted to do or how to do it. Some people had an idea what they wanted to do, but they had no idea how to do it. And in the course of his teaching us this, the problem was that Lyndon LaRouche came up against some very powerful enemies, which enemies shape policy in America to this very day. Now, a few of them are still alive, like George Shultz, for example, whose father, Beryl Shultz, together with Prescott Bush, were the architects of a combination of changes in the 20th century, but essentially what we today would call modern fascism. For Prescott Bush, we've talked about as being the person that funded Adolf Hitler, particularly in 1932. Beryl Shultz, however, was also part of what was called the Trust, the Anglo-American Trust, that group of corporations and that group of financiers associated with Wall Street in the city of London that shaped, financed, supported Hitler and those people, that is to say the economics minister, Hjalmar Schacht, who was primarily responsible for bringing Adolf Hitler to power. Adolf Hitler was brought to power over a 2 to 3 year period in which Hjalmar Schacht resigned from his position as the as a head of the Reichsbank. He was a member of the Liberal Party, and he then began the process of organizing the Bank of International Settlements, and he was the campaign manager for Adolf Hitler. He later then he returned to Germany as the finance minister, as he had been in the 1920s. He'd been drafted for his position by the Dulles brothers, among others, supported in his position. He volunteered for it. But he became the person that campaigned for and established Hitler in power. And he, Hjalmar Schacht, was at Nuremberg, but he was not convicted of any crimes at Nuremberg. The Dulles brothers and people like Prescott Bush made sure of that. Of course, we're told that in 2016, we ought to accept another Bush into the White House. Interesting to think about. Remember the days, some of you may remember the days when people complained about the idea of a Kennedy dynasty. It was going to be John Kennedy, and then it was going to be Bobby Kennedy, and then it was going to be Ted Kennedy, and this was some kind of Irish Catholic conspiracy, so forth. This was a bad thing. Of course, it didn't happen. But yet, we have a Bush 41, a Bush 43, we have a Bush 44, and now we're going to get a Bush 45. Yes, I included Obama with the Bushes, because that's, of course, what he is. So the reason for therefore referring to Beryl Shultz or to others of LaRouche's historic enemies Beryl Schultz was one, Prescott Bush and the Bush family are another. But there's a particular individual by the name of Mac George Bundy. Mac George Bundy is dead. He was the national security advisor for Kennedy for a period of time. If you see any of the popular movies about the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's a character that you see there. Well, Mac George Bundy was also known informally as the head of the establishment, chairman of the establishment. He was precocious. He was a sort of brilliant person. He and his brother, William Bundy, were heads of intelligence, Central Intelligence, and also Yale University. And of course, Mac George Bundy, I think, was the youngest president of Yale ever. But Bundy went about the process of dismantling America, starting from the period just after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. What happened to King after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was that King's movement of March 65 was upstaged quickly by something called Black Power. Now, the thing called Black Power is, generally speaking, blamed on Stokely Carmichael, but it should be noted that the book called Black Power, which is the basis upon which Stokely became the so-called head of or spokesman for the Black Power movement, was written by him and a man named Charles V. Hamilton from Columbia University. And it's more notable to look at the fact that this book was first published in London and then published in the United States. And what's important about it is that it was a rejection of nonviolence and of King's proven successful political organizing method in favor of something akin to, or at least purported to be, guerrilla war. That the black community of the Americas was really like a colony inside of an imperial power, and that the ghettos were colonized, and that the only way that you could actually get freedom for black people was Black Power. Well, in June of 1966, Mac George Bundy went from being the National Security Council head to becoming the head of the Ford Foundation. And he gave a speech in Philadelphia in which he announced that the Ford Foundation was going to make sure that it made every effort to negotiate with, get to know, and dialogue with the Black Power movement. He also said he wasn't exactly sure what Black Power was. What he meant was they hadn't yet finished making it up in the laboratory. So he wasn't exactly sure what it was about to become. They targeted in specific Detroit with the Detroit riot, which took us from a situation of Detroit being the city in the United States with the highest living standard of any city in America. The highest living standard was in Detroit because of the United Auto Workers, because of the extensive trade union movement that had been built up there, and because of the fact that that was also, and here's why King was interested in it, is that Reverend Franklin, Aretha's father, had integrated the UAW together with some other people during the 1950s. And they had established a working relationship with Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, such that when King needed to show mass support for President Kennedy and his civil rights bill, he went to the United Auto Workers and Walter Reuther for that support. And what you call the March on Washington was called by King and by A. Philip Randolph, who was the head of that march, the March for Jobs and Freedom. Jobs and freedom. The United Auto Workers made up about 40%, while the unions as a whole made up about half of all of the people that came to the March on Washington. And the first time that the I Have a Dream speech was given at Cobalt Hall in Detroit 2 months before people heard it in front of the Lincoln Memorial. My contention is that Mac George Bundy, the Ford Foundation, and various other members of the establishment intended, with malice aforethought, to destroy what King had established the basis to do, partially through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, it's not important here for us to go through a lot more of this, because next week, when we do our event on the 17th at Riverside Church, which we can see, I guess now, it will be the case that we will be able to review some other elements of this. But why I state this is that Mac George Bundy was the chosen enemy of Lyndon LaRouche in the very first campaign that our organization did, or at least in terms of the members of the organization, such as myself and others. And that was here in New York City. LaRouche revealed that the so-called New Left leaders, and some of later the Black Power people, were actually being funded by the Ford Foundation, particularly the student radicals. And he referred to this in a pamphlet he wrote at the time called The New Left, Local Control and Fascism. Now, what this was about was, at that time, there was this movement for community control. First, it was around the school system. And community control was supposed to be, let's make sure that the curriculum taught in the schools is relevant to our kids. Actually, what it was about was getting rid of all of the Jewish teachers in the New York City school system, who themselves were largely the product of trade union and other movements, some of it socialist and so forth, from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, but they had achieved a high degree of educational proficiency in the public school system. And remember, City College of New York was free then, free. So what happened was that McGeorge Bundy, as head of the Ford Foundation, specifically targeted the city of New York and the racism, ostensibly, of the Jewish school teachers by deploying student radicals that he funded for the purpose of establishing 32 community control districts in New York. And what happened was that down in Brooklyn in particular, in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, this thing erupted so that on the one side we had the so-called Black Power people, and on the other side we had born, at the time, what was called the Jewish Defense League, the JDL. They were born in this campaign in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, the JDL. Now, we could say much more here, but we won't, because there's something more significant about Mac George Bundy and LaRouche. LaRouche also wrote at the time a very short piece called Why the CIA Often Succeeds. And he wrote it because, you know, the radicals at the period were always talking about how they were exposing the CIA doing this or that. But LaRouche was more interested in the idea, well, wait a minute, actually much of the time what they do works. Why does it work? Well, I'm not going to go through what he says in that piece, but I want to now take something up about why what you just saw here around the 28 pages and what we could do with it is the last thing that most Americans will think to do with it. Let me repeat what I just said. You just saw something which is the most powerful weapon you could have been given to basically, essentially, neutralize, although you that neutralize the, not merely 9/11, but the killings of John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the attempted assassination of Reagan, and so forth. If you knew how to use this, this would cause all the trees in the forest to eventually fall. This is exactly what, generally speaking, most people who see this press conference will block out entirely. They will claim that this is not that significant. They will claim that there still has to be something done by responsible members of the Congress to actually make sure that these pages are actually released. They will claim that the problem is, of course, that Obama's not going to, in fact, declassify them. They will claim, they will claim, they will claim. That is why the CIA, although today that's an acronym, that's a misnomer, because what we used to call CIA 45 years ago doesn't exist in that form. And we're not really talking about an agency, the CIA. Then he was. Now we are not. But the reason that the forms of oppression, including the dominance by Wall Street of the lives of the American people, to the point of looting people to the point that they will pay $14 to come across the George Washington Bridge.
Yeah.
And not complain about that.
Yeah.
This is due to the fact that in the people there is cowardice induced by the assassinations and by the fear that basically the kind of thing you saw in Paris will be coming to a neighborhood near you. You know, like the movie theaters where you show, let's make sure they don't make another Batman movie. You know, right? There's a Batman movie, then a bunch of people are going to die in a movie theater. You know this, right? Of course, my own view would be that, you know, maybe that's the price of going to see a Batman movie. But my point here is that that's why people are afraid. They're terrified that if they actually tell the truth or come together with people who are telling the truth, unify with them, and walk forward with that, you know, drone will appear at your bathroom window. Now, that's not unreasonable, but you're not going to stop it by not fighting it. This is really the issue. So, for example, I mentioned to some of our members in Montreal. Montreal, Canada has a certain relationship to Paris, France. And in Ottawa, Canada, a few months ago, there was a killing at the Ottawa Parliament. Shooter, he managed not to shoot that many people, but so there's worry there about the idea that such things will begin to occur in Canada. We were talking about this, and I referenced to them that, you know, if our organization had not had Lynn and LaRouche, most of us would be dead. Because the idea that, well, if you simply expose the establishment, or Wall Street, or whomever else we're talking about, the banks, if you simply expose that to the American people will respond to that. Oh no, that will get you killed. If that's all we had been doing for the last many years, we would have been dead a long, long time ago. LaRouche didn't do that. What he did was he made policy, including making policy against the wishes of the establishment. And he did this on several occasions, but he did it because of his understanding of physical economy. Now this gets us to this issue of Hamilton and Lynn. Now for this purpose, what I'm going to do is to refer to really two passages, really. Oh, actually, one passage from LaRouche in which he's discussing the idea of what he calls negative growth. In other words, what you're living through right now, what's about to happen, what has been happening to Greece course, Greece is about to pull out of the euro. That would be, we'll see what happens with the January 25th elections. But the process you've seen of deindustrialization in the United States, and impoverishment and greater immiseration of the population. And he points something out which is important to understand. He says, and this is from 1974, and I'm quoting it because it goes with the narrative of what I'm saying. It should be obvious enough to permit omitting extensive explanation that an ecology cannot drop to thermodynamically lower states by simply reversing the successive steps of preceding development. The special conditions under which preceding development was premised have been permanently used up. Life must be brought down to lower states of momentary equilibrium value, but not on the basis of resources which were largely exhausted during the ascending phase. The only efficient resource of the ecology during a descending phase is the burning up of forms associated with higher levels of what he calls negentropy. In other words, you can't go backwards. There is no such thing as simply dismantling a society and going backwards in time. You know, you hear this from environmentalists and others. We'll go back. You can't go back. No, all you can do, because the conditions under which you got to where you are no longer exist. It's like this discussion around oil that continually goes on. Now, we're not talking about how much oil there is on the planet or anything like that. That's not my intent. But look at what actually happens around the so-called fracking scam. Look at what people were induced to believe was going to happen as a result of investing in fracking. Now look at the oil price and ask yourself the question, what was that all actually about? Further, how was it possible for the delusion to be believed by so many people so deeply? In other words, the notion that fracking was going to be some sort of giant windfall for oil production was always absurd. Always absurd. It was never what they were doing. But it was believed by all sorts of people. I don't mean that people shouldn't have opposed fracking. Opposing fracking made sense. But there was a different issue. The delusion, the ability to stampede people into absurd delusion. What does this have to do with physical economy? Well, ask yourself this question. How is it possible for 300+ million Americans to believe that their country could possibly be prosperous, producing far less than it ever did, with 13% of the workforce actually in productive labor, but with twice as many, 3 times as many people as we've had in the past? How do you popularize that level of clear madness? How's it happen? Well, it's called brainwashing. Now, there are ways that brainwashing happens, and usefully, again, I refer to this document, because in the beginning of the document, Mr. LaRouche talks about different methods of brainwashing. And he gives 2. Well, he gives 3, actually. So I'll just read what he says. One is named after a man named B.F. Skinner, who was a criminal, actually, putting it very simply. He was a behavioral psychologist and was very popular in the 1970s. He wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which sort of gave away what the purpose of his researches was. So LaRouche says functional brainwashing cases fall into broad types according to the effects of the methods of conditioning. A, Skinnerian, named after B.F. Skinner. This is the crudest variety of brainwashing, or aversive conditioning, in which the victimized individual is reduced to some degree of autism, that is depersonalization, habituated to respond idiotically according to induced habits of response, according to similarity of functional environment as a dominant stimulus. This crude cognition-damaging form of brainwashing is suited to factory slaves doing unskilled repetitive labor. Second type, Pavlovian. Pavlov was a Russian brainwasher. This is true brainwashing in which control of individual behavior is made subject to a specific kind of external social authority, and in which the individual's dissociated persona is given one or more surrogate social identities in addition to the specific task response conditioning. Now, that's like the shooter in Washington who kept saying, the one that killed all the people at the military base a couple of years ago, who kept saying that he kept hearing radio signals. And he kept making this point that, you know, he didn't want to do what he was doing, but he was doing it anyway. Then Lynn adds one other feature to this. He says, there is another case in which may combine functional brainwashing with the victim being controlled in whole or in part through continued drugging, psychosurgical alteration, and or brain implants. Now, before you get weirded out about this, let's just look at the fact that in the United States, at different times, there have been initiatives for brainwashing, which have been more popular at some times than others. I'll give you two. This is from 1968. We're talking about three people who are neurosurgeons and psychiatrists. Frank Irvin, who was a psychiatrist, and then neurosurgeons Vernon Mark and William Sweet. Here's why these people were at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Boston City Hospital. In testimony on civil disorder before a New York State Legislative Committee in 1968, according to the New York Times, William Sweet said that mass violence, this is a quote, might be touched off by leaders suffering from temporal seizures of the brain. The proponents of urban disorders seem to be the people who are most likely to suffer from organic brain disease. And then there's a cover story from Life magazine from 1968 June, in which it says, this is Life magazine talking, in a slum neighborhood, everyone may live under the same frustrating set of pressures and tensions, but only a small minority will engage in rioting, and even among the rioters, only a handful will actually burn down a building or assault another person. Thus, psychobiology proceeds on the premise that violent acts are carried out by violent individuals, even if the individuals are part of a mob. And what they go on to talk about is, well, here's a book called 1969, Jose Delgado, Physical Control of the Brain Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society. Now, I'm going to skip ahead because I just want to sort of indicate things here to you, because I want you to understand there was something called the Violence Initiative. Some of you may remember this. This is 20 years ago, 1992, 94. This is when prescriptions began to be given in large numbers to children of Ritalin. So you may wish to know why that occurred. There was a person by the name of Goodwin, Fred Goodwin, Congressman John Conyers at the time, went after him. And he had the following to say. This is Goodwin talking about his violence initiative, which was adopted by the United States through various ways, through government agencies, foundations, and mental health programs. He said, if you look, for example, at male monkeys, especially in the wild, roughly half of them survive to adulthood. The other half die by violence. That is the natural way of it for males, to knock each other off, and in fact there are some interesting evolutionary implications of that, because the same hyper-aggressive monkeys who kill each other are also hypersexual. So they copulate more, and therefore they reproduce more to offset the fact that half of them are dying. Now, one could say this, that if some of the loss of structure in this society, and particularly in the high-impact inner city areas, has removed some of the civilizing evolutionary things that we have built up. And that maybe it isn't just careless use of the word when people call certain areas of certain cities jungles. That we may have gone back to what might be more natural without all of the social controls that we have imposed upon ourselves as a civilization over thousands of years in our own evolution. That got Kanye's attention, as you might imagine. And so they went after these people, but it didn't matter because what these people were talking about was they wanted to replace lobotomies with neurocycle surgery. Neurocycle surgery involved the use of various forms of psychotropic drugs. Now, just as one statistic so one understands this sort of thing, if you look at today, foster homes, and you compare children in foster homes to children that are not in foster homes, if you look at the drugs assigned to the kids in foster homes, 9 out of 10 of them are psychotropic drugs. If you look at the drugs assigned to kids not in foster homes, 1 out of 10 of them are psychotropic drugs. So simply, the reason that those kids are given those drugs is to shut them up, sedate them, and basically chemically lobotomize them. That's right now today. 1 out of every 7 kids in America is on some sort of drug. So you see, it goes beyond, you know, just talking about the idea of these foster home kids. And I'm going through this because when you ask the question, people often ask this, how come we can't get responses from people? How come people aren't getting up and doing something about? Well, you know, you should ask that question if you get the occasion to members of the United Nations who are at the consulates and missions, and they will tell you, several of them, if they're honest with you, that they all know that a large proportion of the American population is simply mentally incompetent because they're drugged. Now, they can't, however, explain to their populations that that mental incompetence, due to things like psychotropic alteration, is the reason that they ought to accept their nations being droned. They can't explain to their populations that the fact that many Americans can't see straight at any time of the day. We're not talking here now about the people who are using drugs for recreational purposes. Okay? See, they can't use that as an explanation for why illegal sanctions are applied to their country. They can't explain that because of the fact that there's virtually no one in the United States that should be allowed to vote among these people taking these psychotropic drugs, that the Congress votes up, you know, various legislation of a war-making nature that renders it absolutely essential for these nations to defend themselves in some way. I mean, they just can't have that as an explanation. You should not expect them to think that they should have to explain this. You should clean this situation up. How could you possibly clean this situation up? What are you going to do? Take the half of the people plus that are taking these drugs, or half the adult population on Facebook, which is another kind of drug? You're going to tell them all to not do it? What's your alternative? What can you do? Well, now this is very, you notice now what I've done, I've shrunk it down like in a brainwashing session. I've shrunk you all down to this little point. Because I wanted you to see this is how it's done. Okay, it may have been a dirty trick, but it's a good thing for you. Because you see how it is that you draw people in and you show them really bad situations, right? And you give them quotes and it's terrifying and it's outrageous, right? And then you come to this point where you say, what can you do? Okay, now, let's kick all that to over here. Now let's go to Lyndon LaRouche again. What he's saying about the 4 laws, what you saw Senator Graham do, which, by the way, was with our help, I'd like to say, and what it is we mean by the Manhattan Project. What was it that LaRouche did in Manhattan? He did something very, very simple. Lyndon LaRouche was as irreverent, as satirical, as polemical, as uncompromising, as obnoxious, as irritating, and as correct as he could be. That's what the Manhattan Project is. You have to be irritating, polemical, satirical, and right. Because if you don't take that approach, you can never get this population to do the right thing. It can't be done. Now we can say, okay, but is there something more concrete? Well, let's take what you saw Senator Graham do about England. What did he do? Senator Graham knows if you are talking about Saudi Arabia, as one diplomat said to us yesterday, this is, I won't say the country, but it's a country that used to be part of what you would call the East Bloc. So let's say if it's Romania and Albania and Bulgaria and Poland and Czechoslovakia, it's one of those countries. So we referenced what had been done by Senator Graham. And when we said, he said this thing is all about Saudi Arabia, the diplomat just interrupted and said, well, of course that means the British. Because everybody who knows that that's the case. Because anybody who even saw the movie Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, Thomas Edward Lawrence.
Oh yeah.
If you even saw the movie, there's only a Saudi Arabia because of the British. It's a family, it's a tribe. That's what's the tribe of Saud, the Arabia of Saud, the Saud family. That's what it is. So everybody that understands that we are attacking the British. Because why? Because that's what controls the United States. And they were the people that conducted 9/11, which Americans are terrified to say or confront or focus on or do anything about. And from the last 42 years, or 40 years, particularly since 1974, when our organization, starting with this magazine and a few other magazines that we put out that year, started naming this, Americans have been terrified. We've been talking about it. And people try to ridicule us and say this and that and blah, 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 right? Then 3,000 people end up dead at the bottom of the World Trade Center, and they still don't have the guts. Americans still don't have the guts to get at who killed them. That is what you were dealing with. And all this stuff about evaporating buildings and the planes had no people and, the AIDS virus was steering the planes. And, this is not important. People say, but it's true. Yeah, well, you know what? I know it's true. Or this or that may be true, but what does that mean? It's true. It's the old thing that Lynn used to say, fish don't wear pants. But what does that prove? That's true, right? Fish don't wear pants. What does it prove? See, so what we're doing, what LaRouche is about, and this is the thing that would upset many people, and it was the thing that intrigued a lot of us, which is what caused us to join him. Right? LaRouche is like, I don't know how to put this, but he's surgical. If you are with Lynn, he is going hunting, and he has a very powerful laser scope, and he has a very powerful weapon, and something's going to die at the end of this. Okay? He is not there to pretend that he's hunting. He's not showing up with a blunderbuss. Okay? That's not what he's doing. And he's not, in other words, posturing that he intends to do something. And that's essentially, if I want to put it simply, what the Manhattan Project is. Now in this context, there's one thing I want to refer to on the strategic side, because I left, I haven't really talked much about the Hamilton side of it, except I want to now set up one last part. There's a book that some of you have heard of before. It's called Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. It was one of Bill Clinton's professors, but we've used this book before. And I just want to refer to something here because I think it's useful for you. Those that go back far enough, particularly, will have a view. This will help to give you an idea. This is from a section of his book, which is called The New Age, chapter 16. Any war performs two rather contradictory services for the social context in which it occurs. On the one hand, it changes the minds of men, especially the defeated, about the factual power relations between the combatants. And on the other hand, it alters the factual situation itself so that changes which in peacetime might have occurred over decades are brought about in a few years. Now, the latter is, of course, very important for what we're talking about. This has been true of all wars, but never has it been truer than in respect to World War II. The age which began in 1945 was a new age from almost every point of view. Looking back, it is now clear that the first generation of the 20th century, from about 1895 to 1939, 44 years, this was a long period of transition from the 19th century world to a totally different world of the 20th century. Then he gives you some of the changes. He says, some of these changes are obvious. A shift from a period of democracy to an age of experts. I like that one. He says that's what happened. As of then, democracy's gone. As of 1945, now it's a world of experts. From a world dominated by Europe and even by Britain to a world divided into three great blocks. That was the first, second, and third world. From a world in which man still lived as he had for millions of years, surrounded by nature, to a situation where nature is dominated and transformed by man. From a system where man's greatest problems were the material ones of man's helplessness in the face of the natural threats of disease, starvation, and the unpredictability of natural catastrophe, to the totally different system of the 60s and 70s, where the greatest threat to man is man himself, and where his greatest problems are the social and non-material ones of what his true goals of existence are, and what use he should make of his immense power over the universe, including his fellow men. Okay, now, so we're in a point of, he says that this was a point of transition which was total. But now, since 1971, August, when the dollar was removed from the gold standard and the Bretton Woods system of 1944 through 71 was ended, there's been now a 44-year period in which devolution has occurred. Not absolutely, but it's been a devolution in every productive sense in the West, in the transatlantic powers. China, India, and others have gone the other way. War has become the economy of the United States, 65% of all production, all productive activity. So all goes within this, is all within this war machine. And when the then Soviet Union had that situation, that's what collapsed it. But more importantly, the monetary dominance by British City of London types of Wall Street and Washington has rendered a situation where, in fact, it's the case that the United States will cease to exist unless some set of its citizens successfully organize others, that is the nation as a whole, to reverse that set of financial and monetary policy, right, that more than anything else determines the life and death situation of every single man, woman, and child in America. You know that if you look at Ferguson, Missouri, that what you'll find is that in the city of Ferguson, and it's true in general in that entire St. Louis County area, that the primary source of revenue for the municipality is parking tickets. Did you know that in Ferguson, Missouri, each household has the equivalent, because they so many tickets that go out, of 3 warrants and $321 per household per year? Because all they do is give people tickets for all kinds of crap.
All cities are that way, including New York.
Well, New York is headed.
Well, it's going there, but in Ferguson, there are no forms of employment that are there by ways in which people could pay this. So what happens, this is the important point, is you don't pay.
Right.
And if you don't pay, you go to jail. And if you go to jail, you lose your job, and you will lose your house. And that is the system that people know exists in Ferguson. So the police department is a tax collection department. It's not law enforcement. It's tax collection. And that's the secret of Ferguson. Racial schmacial has nothing to do with it. It's there because it's St. Louis. So yeah, of course, there's racism there, but that's not what the factor is that's going on right now in Ferguson. So what does it mean that we have these irresponsible people claiming that that is the factor, when they ought to know, including the people that are agitating in the street, that the Chinese offered to rebuild or actually expand the St. Louis airport, which happens to, be right there, as an industrial complex. But of course, yes, City of London and others are the people that are involved in those negotiations. The regular people don't know about it. You know why they don't know about it? They don't know about it because they don't know about the BRICS nations. They don't know that Xi Jinping made that offer to Obama. And Obama makes sure they don't know by sending his close friend Al Sharpton there to not tell them. LaRouche's organization was built destroying people like this. Jeff reminded me, and it was important that he did, he said, look, that's what we were doing in Newark, New Jersey with Baraka. That's what we did. That was the CIA. That's what we said. It was the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. That's what we said. They were doing brainwashing down at Baraka's headquarters, the schools, and so forth. And so that's all true. It's all in the pamphlets we wrote at the time. We were known for talking about brainwashing and brainwashers and terrorism. That's how we started. The Manhattan Project was about taking people like this on and taking them out. That's what we did. But we could only do it because LaRouche had a conception of what the economy, the true physical economy, had to be. And he had taught us this, and he had taught us that anybody that's telling you that there are limits to growth actually has a blueprint for somebody's extinction. So whenever you hear limit growth, you're hearing somebody's supposed to die. And it won't be the people who are putting that policy forward. So this is why we came off the campuses, those of us that did, that he came and got, and went into the streets. And this is why we were nasty and obnoxious and irritating, and it's also why we were right. Now, the issue of Dr. King and us is King was attempting to secure economic justice. If you look at the speech of 1967, Vietnam, that's what he's talking about in there. He says, I was going there, I'm talking to these people in these ghettos, and they're saying to me, well, I'm looking at Vietnam, I'm supposed to go fight in Vietnam, and that's nothing but violence, and there's nothing happening here. There's no so-called poverty program. I mean, but there's nothing here. There's no employment. They're closing the factories. And for those of us who were from those neighborhoods, we know that that's exactly what happened. I'm from Chester, Pennsylvania, that's where I'm from. That's what happened in '64. During Kennedy, there was an expansion of factory and manufacturing employment. When Kennedy was dead, you got to '64. '65 came with the escalation in Vietnam and the 500,000 troops. People went to Vietnam, the factories closed. That's what was the experience of those places. And that's exactly how a place like where I came from being Italian and black, about 50-50, to all black within a period of about 3 years. That's all that occurred. So King was confronted by this, and he talks about this in the speech. He says, I couldn't look at these people and say to them in any truth that, you know, I had the right to demand that they be nonviolent when I'm not calling on my government, which is the major perpetrator of violence in the world today, to be nonviolent. So I have got to therefore oppose the Vietnam War. And he knew what that was going to cost him. That's why he was giving those kinds of speeches at the end of his life, including the day before he died. So that everybody could be clear, he had no mistake about the fact of what he was up against, and he was not only willing to pay that price, he was glad to pay that price. So for people who tell you, Martin Luther King, oh, was so terrible, you know, I mean, he was doing these great things, and then he got killed, and everything ended. See, those people are worse than low. Those people are worse than night crawlers. Because King's speeches were all about the fact that he knew exactly what he had done. And that he was doing what he was doing despite the fact that that might occur. Which, of course, is what soldiers are called upon to do in warfare. That's the whole idea. And Martin Luther King didn't think he was any better than the people from my neighborhood that were being sent to Vietnam to die for nothing that really truly mattered. He thought it was his job to make sure that that was stopped. Okay, so when the BRICS nations ask us to join them, as we watch the world march to World War III, it is our right, it is our duty to answer that according to what the Declaration of Independence tells us, according to what our conscience tells us, and according to what reality tells us. You don't need anything else. See, so anybody who is not clear that in this movement today, the goal is, and should be, as of next week, for example, we ought to have a couple hundred people, 250 people, whatever, there. We should immediately have these people have a notion that they have immediate action to do, which starts with that press conference, getting that around so every American sees that, and stops, you see, their game about nobody in the Congress will ever stand up, they're all corrupt, they're all manipulated, they're all bought. No, that game is now over. Which is the game you were playing so that you didn't have to stand up. You were just saying that so you could absolve yourself as usual. So everybody that we meet, we want them to do that. And the second thing is that on the following Tuesday, because Monday's a holiday, we're going to be going down to Wall Street. And we want to go down to Wall Street, not with 50,000 people, not with 5,000 people, not even with 500 people, just 50 intelligent people. You know, because we figured, you know, these poor kids from Occupy Wall Street, you know, they got it bad. But I mean, what was the truth? It's stupid.
Yeah.
They're stupid. They're stupid. So we ought to do something to help them, right? And we need to do something in terms of counterposing Alexander Hamilton, in particular, to the mess that's in Washington today. So we will go there and we will make the 4 laws of LaRouche. We will concretize them. Yes, of course we'll talk about Glass-Steagall. Yes, of course we'll talk about the credit system. Yes, of course we'll talk about the idea of thermonuclear fusion and so forth. Yes, But the important thing is to embody it. That's the key to the King's movement, and that's the key to what LaRouche was doing from the time of the late 60s here in Manhattan. And the way that you do it is you seek the enemy that you know is the enemy, you name that enemy, and you say, I am going to destroy this enemy, and you do that. And that's called economics. That's physical economics. There's nothing macho about that. I mean, that's the conception we have to realize, is that the idea that LaRouche has about taking the most advanced technologies and imposing them so that the largest number of people in the smallest, within a given geographic unit of measurement, have the highest possible living standard. That conception, which is the first approximation, leads to a higher conception, which is that that population which is caused to live that way can now actually provide a completely different platform of existence for humanity to come. See, the purpose of doing that is not to do that for those people so those people live well. No, the purpose of doing that is to create the conditions, the fundamental economic physical platform for the promulgation of a future throughout the universe as a whole. So it's a way of acting on behalf of the universe as a whole in a specific time and place, to the point of acknowledging the tendency of the universe itself to constantly, in a constant accelerating way, arrive toward a higher state of perfection. And even the worst scientists today have to admit that anything that they can see, the universe is in fact winding up, not winding down. Even the worst admit that. So we're simply acknowledging that principle by using physical economy and science and technology to actualize that principle. And anybody that gets in the way of that is the enemy, not only of mankind, but the universe as a whole. So again, we have the right and the duty to go after that. Not because we're trying to beat up somebody, but because we're trying to get something to happen that they are insisting must not be. And we know they are therefore insane because that's all the universe is made of. There's an anti-entropic process of continuous development. So we have no need or prerogative to support or to aid or abet insanity. Okay, so for next week, again, next week's event, we have a lot of things. I guess Diane will say some things about that now. And we hope everybody here will do their part.